Ladies and gentlemen, and all those in between. A very, very warm welcome to you all, joining us on our first online programme for LGBTQ History Month. And I'm delighted to say in partnership with Buckinghamshire Archives. My name is Sue Shave, and I'm the Museum Director for Bucks County Museum. And as you see, beautifully adorned with a flag that I have secured myself from Amazon recently. With me tonight is Daniel Williams, the new County Archivist from Buckinghamshire Archives, and Catherine Gwynn, the Community Outreach and Projects Archivist, also from Buckinghamshire Archives. Tonight we celebrate the lives of LGBTQ people in history, and today my colleagues will be telling you about evidence of LGBTQ lives in the past, and I am going to be telling you about some stories that we have collected from our LGBTQ community over the last couple of years. As a museum, we're very well aware that we have not really represented any of our local communities in the past, and we're working very hard to put that right in collaboration with local communities to collect and display stories that reflect your lives. Now, just before we get going this evening, I do need to warn you that there may be some references to language used in the archives, because those are the terms that we used at the time, that you might find offensive today. And that's just the terminology that they used at the time. Do please use the Q&A, which is at the bottom of your screen, if you hover the cursor over the bottom there. And that will enable you to post questions as we go along. But I do need to just make it clear we're not going to actually have a discussion or answer those questions until the end. But just to stop you forgetting what it is you'd like to ask, please do post them as we go along. The audience won't be able to see those questions, but the panelists will. And then right at the end, we're delighted to welcome another surprise guest, Ross Tackley from the Office for National Statistics. Will be joining us later as he's managing the census this year, and he's going to be telling you about some of the new questions on gender. So just to kick us off tonight, I'm going to be talking to you about what we do with our LGBTQ communities and the collaborations that have brought us to this evening. I know that some of you who are with us tonight actually came along to our very first Bucks Museum Pride, if you remember it, do you, in 2018. So this was the first time, to my knowledge, that Bucks Museum had ever done anything along those lines. As I'm LGBTQ, it was a very important subject to me, but it's also important that organisations like museums and archives do represent people's lives, because we're missing a whole chunk of people if we don't. So in that first year, this wonderful picture here of drag king Adam All, with his real-life partner, Apple Derriere, joined us, along with drag queen Topsy Redfern. And that first event, we asked people from the LGBTQ community to bring along stories and objects that reflected their lives. We didn't really know what to expect, but we were overwhelmed with the first 5 people through the doors, all said, here, we've got our objects we want to donate. So that was absolutely incredible, and you're going to effectively virtually meet those people, or at least hear about their stories and see their objects as a result. So we're very grateful if any of you are with us tonight for getting that going, really, and getting that started. And then about a year later, we had the opportunity to do another Pride. And here I have to say a huge thank you to Aylesbury Town Council, who gave us a very generous grant to make this event happen in 2019, and also to what was then known as Buckinghamshire County Council, now Buckinghamshire Council, who also gave a grant, and we're very grateful to them, because it helped to bring us lots of new acts, and we also did story parties and LGBTQ craft. It was a great evening, and again, I know there are 1 or 2 people here watching who were there, so thank you for supporting us. So this is what it looked like. We had people like Hannah Brackenbury, who from the Brighton scene, who is a very funny performer. We had, this is Oxford Drag Collective, who sent us a couple of their performers posing beautifully for the camera there. And then we had a flash mob, which they basically led, and that was a wonderful way to end the evening, because everybody really got involved. So a great evening. And of course, we were going to do one in 2020, but that was all off thanks to the pandemic. So what we did do, with particularly with all of those objects that people had very kindly given to us, was to create an exhibition. It was a temporary exhibition called Community Voices. And this exhibition really represented not just LGBTQ community, but also really 15 other communities, and 52 people contributed objects and stories in their own words. And as you can see here, although it wasn't a large exhibition, it did feature a huge range of objects and stories. And there were people from our community that were able to donate things and said to me, look, I've never been in an exhibition before. Nobody's ever cared about, LGBTQ histories or my life or my contribution. And we were also able to, sort of, you can see on this with my cursor, but underneath this piece of artwork, which is my first story, so I'm not going to talk about it just yet, we've actually created, using some swell paper, we've actually been able to raise that pattern so that with other artworks that were given by our friend here, it meant that people could actually feel the patterns and if they weren't able to see them, and there were a lot of people who actually really benefited from that. So our first story tonight is that piece of artwork, and that piece of artwork, it's very special to me. I'm sure it's very special to the person who generated it too. It's special to me because it was the very first object from all the communities in our 2-year efforts to collect objects and stories. So it was wonderful to have this come forward with this story to go with it. So this is from Emma, and this is a piece of artwork called LGBT Trees. And I'm going to read you the stories in their own words, as I think they say it so much better than I ever could. So I want you to be able to hear their voices. So this is what Emma says about LGBT Trees that she created. So she says, I'm a local artist and a transgender woman, and I own a company. This is a print of my piece, LGBT Trees. The idea for this really comes from 2 angles. One, I felt like I wanted to do a piece which represented the LGBTQ community, of which I'm part. And 2, I wanted to create a piece of something with something amusing about it, a play on words. One of my strengths, according to others, is that I'm funny, that I can make people laugh. Just because a piece is LGBTQ related doesn't mean it has to be serious or all doom and gloom. It's fun, it's colour, it's whatever you want it to be, really. Our second story centres around some clubbing pants. This was a gift from a friend of mine, and when he offered me some underpants, I did think it would really shake the foundations of Bucks County Museum, and I think indeed it did. It is a wonderful story. This is Andy in his own words. When I was a kid, back in 1980, I used to go to a great nightclub underneath Charing Cross Station. Some of you might remember it. It was called Heaven, and it was the in place for us young gay kids. It was completely amazing. There was nowhere else like it, and it gave us youngsters a real sense of identity. There was one time I was there with some new friends, and we were approached by the guy who arranges the floor shows. Apparently, the main act hadn't turned up and he needed something as a distraction. So he said, would us gang of twinks like to go do some go-go dancing in the cages? Well, we were all young, stupid and slightly drunk, so we said, yes, of course. So they took us off to one of the back rooms where we stripped off and were issued with a pair of gold lame Speedos. Witness said Speedos. We were an absolute hit and spent the rest of the evening surrounded by fans and admirers. Sadly, those days are gone when I had a physique rather than a body type, and that's long gone, really. When I get depressed about things, when I look back and I think about what I've lost, I do get a real twinge of nostalgia about this. So for me, these pants represent a time when I was young, carefree, and almost terminally stupid. I don't want those days back again. But I hope young people of today will have their own heaven days, their own glory days to hold in their memories. Our third story centres around one of these wonderful handmade badges, BU. And this is M's story. So M says, LGBTQ+ is a community built around taking pride in who you are and wearing it confidently on your sleeve, or maybe on your jumper. We are a rainbow of people with a kaleidoscope of sexualities and gender. We push limits, we shock, we stand out for who we are, and we don't apologise for it. As a queer artist, I wanted to help people express to the world who they are through this perfectly small, round comfort of a badge. It may only be a small thing that people can perhaps easily overlook, but I find it gives people the confidence to be their authentic self. I have actually witnessed people come out to loved ones by buying one of my badges and clipping it on with pride towards their community. Wear a badge. Be queer. Be proud. Be you. My fourth story here is about an early teenage love present and an experience that I think many people watching may well be able to identify with. So this is Laura, and she says, my first love was a rebel. She was pink-tinted chapstick and cigarette smoke, old woolen jumpers, army boots. She was the dusty backstage of our theatre studio and the smudged left-handed ink written in the back of my workbooks. She was many things to me, but the biggest thing she was a secret. There's no secret that gay was bad at my school. The one girl who was brave enough to come out in my year became a pale, quiet imitation of a human being who couldn't escape abuse no matter how deeply she cut into her arms. She was a walking consequence we couldn't ignore. My lover gave me this necklace at school. In a rush of blushing cheeks and whispered words, given license by the subterfuge offered by the Christmas season. If you hold it just so, there's a rainbow, a hidden one deep inside. It felt right. I just saw it and I thought of you. It was I love you in Terrified Teenager. She was my first in many ways, and I will never forget her. Perhaps most importantly, I will never ever forget the importance of loving freely and openly again. I came out 2 years later and have since spent many years supporting LGBT+ and GSRD folks. Hidden rainbows are my past, and that is where they should stay. And then our last story tonight is from Max. And this is particularly around this lovely silver jacket. It is very desirable. I'd like to take it home myself. And the Gay Club leaflet. We'll come back to Dana International in a minute. So Max says, I loved wearing this jacket. It felt ultra modern and part of the 1970s revival of retro music and culture that happened in the 90s. I bought it from a specialist clothing shop called Key Largo in Covent Garden, and that sold nightclub wear. I wore it when I went to GAY, which was a club in the Astoria nightclub on the Tottenham Court Road in London. It was the biggest gay night in London at the time, if not Europe, and it attracted people like Kylie Minogue, Boy George, Spice Girls, and Take That. Now, Max doesn't talk about this in his label that he submitted for this exhibition, but this must have been where I understand he actually met Dana International. You may all remember Dana International, one of the first famous transgender women. She won Eurovision in 1999. And in case you've forgotten, there it is on the back of the postcard that she obviously gave to Max. Apparently he met her and she was extremely supportive about coming out and making him feel confident about being who he was meant to be. What an incredible experience that must have been to actually meet somebody like Dana International. He goes on to say, I often went out with my friend Donna. We were friends when I was about 21, and she too gave me a lot of confidence about my sexuality and to explore being myself through clothes like these. I knew I was gay when I was at school, but I didn't come out until 1995 when I was 20 and at university. Growing up, I didn't know any other gay teenagers, and I felt very isolated in Aylesbury. I was ignorant about gay people, bars, clubs, and even the gay pub in town called the Saracen's Head, which I believe is now closed. I remember my PSE teacher at school showing us a video of gay people talking on TV and teaching us about HIV and contraception, including a practical exercise with condoms and carrots. Now, who could forget that? He says he most definitely didn't forget it. It was quite daring and brave of her 30 years ago. Under Section 28, she could, of course, have lost her job. And the reference there to sex education, particularly about HIV and AIDS, don't know if any of you have been watching the It's a Sin series from Russell Davies. Fantastic. If you haven't, please watch it. It's many things. It's funny, it's sad, it's outrageous, the way that people were treated and the experiences that people had. So all of those things that these experiences are about, how people have coped and how people have found ways around it and been able to celebrate, but things have been very difficult, and sharing those experiences and realizing you're not the only one is really important. So what are we going to do with all of these objects and stories? We've had a temporary exhibition and that was fantastic. And I think, for me, I actually found it very emotional, because I've worked in museums for about 30 years, but I've never worked anywhere where people like me were represented in exhibitions. So it was fantastic to see that. I know that applies to many other communities as well at the museum. But we are creating 5 new galleries. We hope to open later on this year. And these galleries will tell the story of Bucks people and landscapes from 200 million years ago to today. So in this picture, which shows you the Bucks People Gallery, which will cover sort of last few hundred years, we will be putting some of those displays. We're asking some of our community groups to write labels so that they become visible just by virtue of their voices. And also, as you see at the back there, those portraits, we are looking for people to come forward. We want to create these digital portraits, A1 size, and we've got lots of themes from heroes, particularly during the pandemic, through to a whole range of communities and conflict and all sorts of other things. So if you are interested in helping us to find people to be in those photos, we don't want to make those decisions. We want you, the community, to make them. And we also want more objects and stories like the ones that I've just been telling you about, so that your lives and your experiences are reflected in our future displays and you see yourself reflected there. So thank you very much. I am now going to pass over to Daniel Williams. Daniel has only very recently joined us at the archives, and I'm absolutely delighted and very grateful to Daniel and Catherine for being so keen to do something for LGBTQ History Month. You'll see a very different side now in what Daniel is going to be talking about from the archives. Daniel. Daniel, you might need to unmute yourself.
There we are. Can you hear me now? Excellent. I knew something, but I knew I'd forget that. Let me go back. So I'm delighted to be here this evening. It's great being able to work with Sue and the museum service, but it's also great to be able to share my love of archives. I have, I think, one of the best jobs anybody could have. If you love history, working with original documents really just can't be beaten. And this evening, I'm going to tell you about some stories which are missing from the archives. But by missing, what I mean is they're there, but they're hidden. They need to be uncovered. So I'm going to go through tonight some stories from other archives around the from around the country. I'm going to focus on archives as a source of information. I like to think of archives really being the ingredients of history. Think a bit Mary Berry making her cakes, and historians, they get together the ingredients, the archives, the information from the history, and they create their historical pieces, their work. So I'm going to focus on the archives, and I'm going to answer some questions. First of all, what are archives? Why are LGBTQ stories missing? And where do we need to look to find them? But the main piece of my talk this evening is going to be looking at and showing you some examples of LGBTQ stories from other archives around the country. And then importantly, I'm going to finish by showing and telling you a little bit about how we together can make a difference. So first of all, then, what are archives? And the question that we're often asked is, are they a bit like a library? Now, if you ask an archivist that question, we'll probably close our eyes and shake our heads and look sad and say no. Archives and libraries are actually quite different. So archives are original sources. They are the sources that historians and authors will make to create their secondary sources. Archives are all unique. That's one of the things which sets them apart. So, for example, we say the Mona Lisa might be priceless, irreplaceable Van Gogh paintings, but so indeed are all archives. They're unique documents. Once they're lost to history, they are lost. So that's the difference between a library. Archives are the primary original sources, and libraries hold the secondary sources. Even a very rare library book may well have another copy somewhere else. And in Buckinghamshire archives, we have, believe it or not, over 800 years of Buckinghamshire's collective history. I like to think of archives as the memory of Buckinghamshire. And within the archives that we hold, within those 800 years, are records covering all aspects of life within the county. You may well like watching EastEnders or listening to The Archers, whatever it might be, because of those human interest stories. Well, they are all in the archives, just waiting to be uncovered, including the stories of our LGBT ancestors going back. So we preserve Buckinghamshire's memory, and I like to think of archives as a place where really memory is stored and history is made. I think that's a great phrase which sums up what archives are. So why are LGBTQ stories missing? And the reason is that cataloguers today, archivists such as myself, when we are cataloguing new archives which are coming in all the time, we record things that we think are important. Now, our predecessors in the archives would have done exactly the same. And what I'm going to say now isn't passing judgment or condemning, it is just saying the fact that previous generations of archivists would have recorded what they thought were important, and LGBTQ history wasn't something they would have thought of important. That's why those stories are missing. They're there, but they haven't been recorded, they haven't been indexed or catalogued. But they're not the only ones that are missing. Black history is another really big example of memories and voices of our Black ancestors from the past, whose stories, just like LGBTQ voices, are there waiting to be uncovered. This isn't peculiar to Buckinghamshire by any means. Every archive throughout the country, every local authority archive throughout the country, and probably around the world as well, will be facing similar challenges, how to unearth these really fascinating stories which deserve to be told. So where in the archives do we need to look to find these voices? as with all research in archives, we need to think about who would have created the records or the information that we need. And because homosexuality has been illegal for most of the past, up till 1967, and the Sexual Offences Act, which decriminalised homosexual acts between men over 21 in private, we would need to look for official records, such as police, homosexuals being arrested, courts where they were went to be tried, and jail where they were often homosexuals would have been imprisoned. Newspapers are a fantastic source of information. I'm going to give you some examples a little bit later, as are personal diaries, and again some more examples later on. So we can look within the archives at those official sources, and they will give us often a snapshot, maybe a 1 or 2 line entry. And then from that, we can build a picture by looking at other archives, newspapers, diaries, all sorts of other sources that we have to really build a really coherent, vibrant, living picture of the stories that we are uncovering. So before I move on, I just want to reiterate really what Sue said earlier about terminology. We really have to put our 21st century sensibilities to one side when we're looking and working with archives, because they are going to use the terminology of the time, which today we may well find offensive, but we need to keep those terms and in mind to help us unearth those stories. So let me now show you and talk about some of those stories from other archives. And sadly, none of them at the moment are from Buckinghamshire, but hopefully I will inspire some people who are listening to this presentation to want to come and help us at Buckinghamshire Archive to discover these stories. So LGBT History Month next year, we will be using stories from our own county, giving our own ancestors from the county a voice, having those memories heard. So my first story, I'm going to take you right back over 620 years. In fact, I'm going to take you to the first Sunday in December, 1394. I'm going to be even more precise. I'm going to take you between 8 and 9 o'clock that evening. I'm going to tell you the story about a person who went by the name at different times of John and Eleanor Rykener. Now, on this probably quite cold, chilly December night in 1394, John Eleanor was walking the streets of London, hopefully wrapped up quite warmly because it would have been quite cold. And John Eleanor was working as a prostitute at that time. And John Britby, who was a chap from Yorkshire who had made his way down to London, and in the records is described as rather naive, paid John Eleanor for their services, and they went to an alley. So, but getting better acquainted, as you might have guessed, is a euphemism. And while they were there, they were arrested and they were taken before the mayor's court. And you can see that in the image there, an extract from the document, which was written in Latin. And it is believed to be the only example from this period of medieval history of a legal document dealing with homosexual acts. It is unusually full and detailed. And if you're interested and you Google later on, there are transcripts in English which show the great detail that the court case went into. The case would have been, if it was happening today, would have been absolute joy for the tabloid press. It was a story which covered cross-dressing, male prostitution, homosexual acts, and clerical promiscuity. John Eleanor, in his testimony, records liaisons with priests and nuns, and a whole colourful history. Directly before going to London, John Eleanor was in Oxford, where at different times working as a barmaid, a seamstress, and as a prostitute. When John Eleanor moved down to London, worked the area around the Tower of London as well. So we get a really, really an important historical document for the role of history of gender and sexuality in the UK. Incredibly important document. But as so often with archives, we get a snapshot. We have a very detailed account of a particular time, very detailed. We can even give you the time, but we don't really know what happened later to John Eleanor. A historian has done some research and found that someone with the name John Rykener a few years later is recorded as escaping from jail, but we cannot know for certain whether this is the same person. So I've started with this one, this account, for its historical importance. I'm now going to jump quite a few centuries forward to 1810. I'm going to introduce you to a Yorkshire farmer called Matthew Tomlinson. Now, Matthew Tomlinson at this point in his life was in his 40s. He was a widower, he was a farmer, and he wrote a diary, a really fascinating diary. In the diary, he records all sorts of aspects of his life, which was going on at the time. He records in great detail about elections, the fraud and the corruption that was going on, about the bully boy gangs, which used to come around to intimidate the voters to make sure they voted in a particular way. Rather amusingly, he describes Queen Victoria's coronation as humbug. He has very, very firm views on lots of different things, life going on at the time. And interestingly, for a Yorkshire farmer in 1810, he writes about homosexuality in a way which is quite startling, maybe to a modern audience. And he puts forward views which we today think is really, really quite modern. And the impetus or the cause really of Matthew writing about it was a big scandal at the time. There was a naval surgeon who was caught committing a homosexual act with another man, and there was a big court case about it. And this caused Matthew to reflect on this. And he came, like so many people at that time, from a religious, a Christian perspective. I'm going to read a quote here from his diary. "It must seem strange indeed that God Almighty should make a being with such a nature, or such a defect in nature, and at the same time make a decree that if that being whom he had formed should at any time follow the dictates of that nature with which he was formed, should be punished with death." So he was thinking this in these Christian terms. God created gay people, so why would God want gay people to be killed? That doesn't make sense. And this is 1810, so it's really radical. And this is a really new discovery in the archive and history world. I came across it myself on BBC News. And in other parts of Matthew's diary, he mentions, for example, he's been talking to his friends, and his friends have told him that homosexuality starts off quite at a young age. You can tell maybe whether someone is homosexual. And it's not as if Matthew and his society were living in sort of isolation. It's clear from his writing that he was very well read. He was also very up to date with the latest news. He knew about revolutions and the Luddites in this country and revolutions abroad. They read the newspapers. They were educated, intelligent men. And this tells us, this challenges, I think, the historical orthodoxy that at this time there was fairly uniform homophobia, as we might do today. Now, we can't get away from the fact, and I'm going to go on to the next slide, that there was widespread homophobia. You can't get away from that. But it also shows that a Yorkshire farmer living in 1810 in the Georgian period before the Victorians was articulating what we would today would regard as a very, very modern views, very enlightened views, perhaps. So my next slide is perhaps one of the most famous, most famous I'm going to talk about this evening, and most famous because of the BBC, perhaps because the BBC drama that was on a year or two, last year or the year before, Gentleman Jack. So Anne Lister has been described as the first modern lesbian, and her diaries are in Wakefield, West Yorkshire archives. Now, I think she was probably described as a first modern lesbian because Anne Lister knew who she was, she accepted who she was, and she was proud of who she was, and she was going to live that life. Everybody else around her in her society, they had the problem. But sadly, it's very clear that they made it her problem as well because of the prejudice that she faced, the abuse, verbal and physical, that she suffered during her lifetime. But we know about Anne because of her diaries. It's been estimated that her diaries run into approximately 5 million words. And just like Matthew before us, she wrote about her life generally. Elections, the weather, social events, all those things that you would write down in one's diary. But what sets Anne apart is that she wrote in code about her sexual relations with other women. And she wrote about these in great detail, but she wrote about them in code, which was later decoded. And we now know about her relationships and how she went about wooing and how she went about getting relationships with other women. And these documents, these diaries are so important. They are now part of the UNESCO Memory of the World programme. I'm just going to read to you what it says, why these diaries are part of this collection. So while a valuable account of the times, it was the comprehensive and painfully honest account of lesbian life and the reflections of her nature which have made these diaries unique. They have shaped and continue to shape the direction of UK gender studies and women's history. I sort of wish, I'll come back to this later. I sort of wish I could go back and just tell Anne, as she faced the terrible discrimination at that time, that future generations would really value her experiences and her writings, and that her experiencing would be a light for future generations. We're lucky because we know what Anne looks like. Not only her writings, we have paintings of what she looked like at the time. But I'm going to mention just briefly Anne Walker, and she might be familiar to many of us because she's a significant figure in the Gentleman Jack BBC series. And there's a danger maybe she's a little bit of becoming a footnote in Anne Lister's story. But Anne Walker was, of course, a very strong lady, very strong woman in her own right. She was wealthy, an heiress, and there is no question that Anne Walker and Anne Lister were very, very deeply in love. They married, they had what's sometimes regarded or put forward as the first same-sex, first lesbian marriage. They were both very, very strong Anglican, both strong, committed Christians. And they went to their parish church in 1834 and took communion together. And for them, this was a very, very special moment, particularly with that Christian meaning of communion. And they regarded this as their bond, their marriage for the future. I understand there's actually a plaque on the church which commemorates this event. Anne, as I said, was a very strong person, Anne Walker, and they both traveled quite extensively and had really quite an amazing life together. And Anne Lister, when she died, age 49 in Georgia, over in Eastern Europe, it was Anne Walker who arranged for the body to be embalmed and brought back to the UK. And recently, and by recently I mean October 2020, we have discovered in the Yorkshire archives a journal written by Anne Walker. So I think there's a really interesting new perspective on this relationship, which is waiting for historians to uncover. Sadly, we don't know what Anne looked like, but in her writings and her journal, I think her voice, her memory is going to be heard. It's been uncovered. I'm going to move on now to, as you can tell by the picture and by the title, what is a sad story, but an important story nonetheless. It's the story of the last men hanged in England for homosexual acts. I'm going to take you back, not quite as far as I did in the first story, but back to the 31st of August, 1835. James Pratt, who's a labourer, aged about 30. The original sources at the time give different ages, but for the sake of argument, he's around 30. He said goodbye to his young wife and his 2 daughters, and he set off in London to go off and try and find work, as he had done on numerous other occasions. At the end of the day, a little bit dejected, he hadn't found work. He went into a pub and he met a chap called William Bonhill and John Smith. Whether this was a chance encounter is a little bit unknown. Had it been a rendezvous? Did he know them before? Or did he just go in and they started getting to know each other over a pint at the time? Contemporary sources have a different slant on it. But what we do know is that the 3 of them met up in the pub and they got on very well. And William invited James and John back to his rented room. Now, I wonder how many times in the weeks and months that followed did James and John wish that they had turned that invitation down, because it was an invitation that was going to lead them to the gallows. When they reached the flat, when they reached the room that William was renting, the door closed and they went inside. Now, unfortunately for them, the landlord and landlady, who were George and Jane Berkshire, didn't like William. They didn't like the fact that William was often bringing men back to his room. So the landlord, George, decided he was going to take a little peek and find out what they were up to. So the contemporary records show that George went out and had a look through the window. It doesn't say what floor it was on, so either, I'm assuming it must be in the ground floor. But either way, he went and had a look through the window and he saw the outrageous act of James sitting on William's knee and laughing. And then he sat on John's knee and laughed. And this shocked him so much, he went back and told his wife, who was equally outraged. And she thought, I'm going to go and have a look and see what's going on too. So she went and had a look through the keyhole. And later on, she said she wasn't there for very long, but she went back and told her husband she had seen James and John engaging in same-sex. So the husband, George, it's all very dramatic, isn't it? It's like EastEnders, went up and he burst into the room, and he says that later on in court, he said he caught James and John in the middle of an act. He went and called the police, who came, and William, who'd been out trying to buy alcohol, tried to calm things down, but he failed, and the 3 of them were arrested and later went to trial. The trial was very widely reported, and again, if you're interested, you can Google this after this talk, and there's a lot of detail. There's transcripts of what happened at the court. James and John were not allowed to give evidence at their own trial. There was no actual evidence apart actually from what the landlady said she had seen through the keyhole. And although she said she had only been there for a short while, she gave a lot of quite detailed evidence about what she saw, which conflicted with her other evidence. The trial in some ways was a little bit of a foregone conclusion. And although there was no evidence other than the testimony of the landlady, Jane, they were both found guilty and sentenced to death. Following the sentence, James seems to have had a lot of support in the community. his wife, his previous employers. They got together with some other people. They put forward testimony trying to get the king, who was at the time who could grant clemency, and the judge to commute the evidence. Poor John doesn't seem to have anybody to support him. But it all fell on deaf ears. And it shows really the hatred and the prejudice against gay people at this time was that 17 people were also sentenced to death by the judge around that time. Murderers, there were rapists, there were thefts, there were all sorts of different crimes. And all of them had their death sentences commuted apart from James and John. On execution day, the 27th of November, 1835, as you can see from the picture, you can just see lots of heads around. Thousands of people came from far and wide to watch. And to modern sensibilities, might seem a bit strange, but in the early 19th century, there was no better day out than to go down to watch a good hanging. So those massive crowds outside and around the scaffold, and poor James and John were led out. And the contemporary sources all agree that the crowd started to hiss. And what terrifying noise that must have been. Now, historians are divided as to why they started to hiss. Some might like to think that they started to hiss because they thought this was an injustice. They shouldn't be hanged. Others suggest that maybe they were hissing because they detested homosexuality and they thought that, you know, these people deserved what they got. In reality, there was probably a mixture of reasons why. But either way, the last sounds those two poor men would hear were the hissing of the crowd. Contemporary sources also report that poor James was so weak and terrified by this event and by what was going on, the executioner's assistants had to physically hold him up while the executioner put the noose around his neck. The story is just absolutely tragic, and they died quite quickly after the drop went. But what of William? William, because he hadn't actually been there, he had gone out to buy alcohol, wasn't sentenced to death. William was a lot older than James, who was 30, John, who was about 40. William was 68. And he was sentenced to transportation to Australia for 14 years. And that's where he died later on, while still under the sentence of transportation. But you may be interested to know that even if he had survived long enough, at the end of the 14 years, he would have had to have earned enough money to get himself back to the UK. There was no free ticket back at the end of that transportation period. So for a 68-year-old man to go on those prison ships all the way around to Australia must have been the most awful ordeal. And then life in Australia in the heat must have been absolutely barbaric for him. And that's where he died. If, and I hope many people who are listening to this will be interested in doing some historical research into our LGBT ancestors, you will still find after 1835 men being sentenced to death for homosexual acts. But always after 1835, they would have been commuted. They would have been changed usually to transportation or imprisonment and hard labor. So James and John have that sad part of our history as being the last two men killed for homosexual acts. Now, I've taken this example from a really interesting project that Glamorgan Archives carried out quite a few years ago now called Queering Glamorgan. There's a free information resource online through the Glamorgan Archive website, which was compiled by Dr. Narina Shopland and Dr. Darrell Leeworthy, which is really interesting. And this is an example from a newspaper, because newspapers often give you the color which the official documents lack. I'll read it to you because it's quite an interesting story. This is from a newspaper in January 1872, a woman marrying a woman. One of the officers of the county police was recently sent to Greenock to bring a prisoner through to Edinburgh. The prisoner is a young woman belonging to Inverness-shire who has been wanted by the police for some time back on the charge of impersonating a man. Obviously against the law, impersonating a man, and the police were involved. Last year, she worked for a considerable time as a labourer in the neighbourhood of Kirk Newton. And so masculine was she in appearance that none of her fellow workers suspected her of belonging to the softer sex. Interesting, the language at the time. By and by, she fell in love with a young woman, a native of Ireland, and the two were ultimately married. For a while, they lived together happily, it is said, but a quarrel having taken place, the wife informed the police of the true sex of her husband. The latter did not want a visit from the gentleman in blue, and at once made good her escape from the neighbourhood. She was not heard of until the other day, when she was apprehended at Greenock, where she had been working as a labourer. What a fantastic story from 1872 of two women living together as a married couple. So again, what archives as the ingredients of history does, it challenges a lot of the preconceptions. It really challenges everything was the same in the past. Everybody held the same view, because they didn't, despite what some of the history books might tell us. And that's why archives are important. So my last example this evening comes from an online source from the proceedings of the Old Bailey. And as with so many archive sources, such as the first one I started with, we have a snapshot of people's lives. In this case, two 17-year-olds who were caught, and this is going back to the language of the time, for the offence of sodomy. And the term which is often used at the time was buggery. And sometimes in the official documents, the admin person going through is so horrified at the crime, they can't even bring themselves to write the whole word. So you might find it abbreviated going through. So here we have a snapshot, a very sad snapshot of two 17-year-olds, two gay 17-year-olds who presumably were in love, or they were together anyway, and they were caught. And because of this, they were sentenced to imprisonment and hard labour. Hawkins to 18 months and Bell to 12 months prison and hard labour. And hard labour meant exactly that. It was back-breaking work. And they had over a year of having to do this at that young age. And I can only imagine really that when their homosexual offence became knowledge in the prison, within the prison community, their lives amongst from the staff and amongst the inmates must have been absolute hell. Now this dates from 1906 into the 20th century. So it shows really that those Victorian ideas were carrying over into the 20th century. And we have, as I said, I keep saying that we have the snapshot. We don't know what happens next. Now, part of me, a romantic part of me, would like to think that Walter and Joseph, after all of this horribleness, they managed to get together and they lived some form of a happy life together. We don't know, but that's highly unlikely. What we do know from these records, as you can see in the middle with related material, is that Joseph Bell appears 6 more times in the Old Bailey records. Walter doesn't, and hopefully he sort of stays out of trouble. But Joseph is in trouble, but not for homosexual acts, but for theft. And by 1920, he's regarded and he's labeled a habitual criminal. But that's a very hard term. But if we want to be a little bit more sympathetic, we can see that what chance did these poor two 7-year-olds have in life? There's no welfare state. Anybody who found out that they'd been in prison for homosexuality wouldn't want to give them a job. How were they supposed to survive? How were they supposed to feed themselves if not by turning to a life of crime, as Joseph did? We don't know what happened to Walter, and that again is where archival research can kick in. Archival research is just like being a detective, just like being in the police. You are looking for different clues in different sources, putting them together, putting the evidence together to create that picture. And Walter's story and Joseph's story, just like so many of our LGBT ancestors, deserves to be told. Their memory deserves to be remembered and not lost. And that's why online sources such as this, archives such as Buckinghamshire Archives, are so important. So some conclusions. It is then, I think, important that the voices and the memory of our LGBTQ ancestors from the past is heard. It's given respect. It can be incredibly difficult and hard to find, especially if there's no electronic sources and you go to the originals. It can be page turning to find those clues. But imagine in Buckinghamshire, if we unearth, our own Anne Lister, our own, Matthew's diary, wouldn't it be great to find some of those stories from Buckinghamshire, to find the Walters story that we've just come across, to find 17-year-olds who suffered injustices in the past just because they loved people of the same sex, to give those voices, make those voices heard, to make those memories not lost but brought back. They're often sad stories. And as I said with Anne Lister earlier, if only we knew, if only they knew that future generations would be talking about them, would be valuing them, that their stories could give hope to future generations, and building on their experiences, future generations wouldn't have to face the same prejudices that they faced. So I'm hoping that many people listening to this would like us here at Buckinghamshire Archives to discover Buckinghamshire LGBTQ voices, to give those people a voice. And hopefully, after all these COVID restrictions have passed, if you're interested, get in contact. We can get together as a group. I can organize some training for us and we can uncover that. So future LGBT history months will hear voices from our county. So I'm going to end there. I hope you found that interesting and stimulating and made you want to come to the archives. If you haven't been before, put it on your post-COVID to-do lists to come and visit us and come and do some research. I'm going to hand over now, as long as I don't mess up the technology, to my colleague, Catherine, who's going to tell you a really fascinating story about two really amazing women, Dr. Flora Murray and Dr. Louisa Anderson, who together have had their voices and their memory heard. So I'm now going to stop sharing and hand back to Sue.
Good evening, everyone. Firstly, I'd just like to say how excited I am that this event is happening and how wonderful it is to be part of it, and just to applaud Sue and Daniel for making it happen. So thank you very much that I can be part of it. I'm going to be talking today about two, as Daniel says, two incredible Buckinghamshire ladies. I'm up against the clock. I've got 10 minutes to tell you about them. And there they are. But it's not going to be a passive ride for you. I need your input on this. The jury is out as to whether they were a lesbian couple or not. So what I'm going to do is to present the case for and against, and I want your opinions at the end. Were Flora and Louisa a loving lesbian couple? But first up, let's meet the ladies. On the left is Flora. Flora was born in the early days of the Victorian era to a wealthy Scots family. Then, as now, wealth gives you options. Not for Flora was the conventional route of marriage and children. She wanted a career. After some time getting some work experience, she entered medical school at the age of 28, graduating some years later from Durham University. And her career? Women doctors could only treat other women and children. something that she herself would change in the course of her working life. Now, Louisa, if Flora had a slightly unconventional upbringing, Louisa's parents threw the rule book out the window with glee. Louisa's mother was a lady you might have heard of called Elizabeth Garrett Anderson. Elizabeth was the very first qualified female physician in the land. And she was also a leading light of the suffrage movement, that is the peaceful movement to secure votes for women. It's safe to say that Louisa grew up in a stimulating, supportive, politically engaged environment where her wanting to study medicine was not viewed as unbecoming. In fact, it was positively encouraged. On qualifying as a doctor, Louisa met the same limitations as Flora, but change was in the air. Stepping beyond the peaceful suffrage movement led by her mother, Louisa became a suffragette, using her medical skills to help suffragettes recovering from hunger strikes. And in the course of this work, she met Flora. And Flora was a suffragette, yes, but she wasn't just any suffragette. She was the personal physician of Emmeline Pankhurst, the leader of the suffragettes. And from this point, their lives became inextricably linked, their personal lives and their professional lives. In 1912, they owned a home together in Penn, Buckinghamshire. That's what brought them to Buckinghamshire. Let's hear a description of that home, Pool End, described by a visitor to the house during World War I called Vera. This audio excerpt is read to me here by a lady called Wendy Moore, who is a recent biographer of the couple. Sue? Ooh, do we have sound? Ooh. Oh, you can't hear it. Shall I read it instead? No? I'm getting no's and yeses. I'll be quiet. Sue, I'm not able to hear that, so I'm just going to read the excerpt instead, just on the off chance other people can't hear it. So this is from Wendy Moore's book, Endell Street, which I'll talk about in a minute. A world away from the air raids and ambulance convoys of London, the country cottage was a haven of tranquility. After catching a train from Marylebone, Vera and Rachel were met at Beaconsfield as promised by an elderly man named Buckles, who drove them in a pony trap through the lush spring countryside to the little village of Penn, nestling in the Chiltern Hills. The two-storey cottage was a gem. Overlooking woods and fields, it was surrounded by clipped lawns and colourful borders, blooming with tulips, wallflowers, and forget-me-nots. Inside contained two of everything, as well as antique curios and expensive china. There were shelves crammed with books on women's rights. As Ray, the other visitor, and I investigated, we could not help thinking what a wonderful pair of women these two are. And we wondered if the plans for their big undertaking had been hatched in this peaceful, faraway spot. Their big undertaking, that was the work that defined their career. I talked to Wendy, the biographer and author of this wonderful book, Endell Street, about Flora and Louisa back in February for our podcast. The book, Endell Street, shines a light on the trailblazing work of the pair during World War II, where they set up their big work, their big undertaking, which was a military hospital in Endell Street, London, staffed almost entirely by women. Now, before World War I, we said women weren't allowed to treat men. This hospital, Endell Street, led by Flora and Louisa, they proved to the world that not only could they take care of and look after men, but look after soldiers who have been injured in the front line with all the medical complications that brings. This podcast is available on our blog. Wendy goes into the history of Endell Street in more detail. If you Google Archive of the Month podcast, you should be able to find it, and I thoroughly recommend the book. Now, before I go on to talk to you about Flora and Louisa's relationship, I want to show you a very short bit of footage. This bit of footage is the reason why, though I've been aware of it, we've not really talked about this story before. Sue, would you mind pressing play? This bit of footage shows the one and only mention of the pair in our archive collection. And it's not the book that I'm flipping through, it's a single entry on one page that I'm getting to, which records the burial of Flora in Penn Cemetery, in Penn Churchyard in 1923. There she is, as both Daniel and Sue have already mentioned and alluded to, it is so hard to tell these stories when we don't have the evidence. And in fact, it was Wendy Moore's book, there we go, there's the cover, that was the catalyst for us actually beginning to talk about this story. Now, as I was talking about earlier, I want your opinion on their relationships. So, were they a loving lesbian couple? No, of course not. Lesbians were invented in the 1960s. No, hang on, lesbians were invented in the 1980s. Or hang on, were maybe lesbians invented yesterday or indeed tomorrow? The point that I'm rather laboriously trying to make is that words and the nuance of their meaning do not necessarily age at the same rate. It's very hard for us to stand here with our modern understanding and impose that and out people of the past. It's something that we have to be very cautious of. So how can we possibly make that judgment? More practically, Flora and Louisa lived together, but that wasn't so unusual at the time. In fact, often spinsters would find it financially beneficial to live together, to pool their resources, especially if they were working in the same profession. There would be a mutual understanding and accommodation for their work, their lifestyle. Now, Daniel mentioned earlier evidence, and evidence is make or break for archives when you're making an argument. So where is the evidence that they were a loving lesbian couple? We have no love letters. We have not their own love letters. We have no gossip. These ladies ran not just one hospital, but several hospitals over the course of their career. If their relationship was an open secret, no one mentioned it in their own diaries or letters. There is literally no mention. There is an acceptance of their partnership, working and living together, but there's no mention that that might be anything other than normal. So that's the arguments against. But sometimes I look at this and I feel more positive. So they owned a house together. I mean, that's more than just renting a place. Owning a house together, that's commitment. That's putting their futures together. Surely that means more than just friendship. Historians are coming around to agreeing that Flora may have had other similar relationships when she lived in Scotland. So there was some precedent. Now, this is the killer bit of evidence for me. Flora and Louisa wore matching diamond rings. I know what I was saying about not judging people by today's standards, but I love my friends, but I would not wear matching rings. Matching rings is trying to aspire to marriage almost. It's a really powerful statement. Now, while I said there was no evidence and that they hadn't written any love letters, they did leave us some clues. So after World War I and Endell Street closed down, Flora wrote a book about the experience of running it. And in the front of the book, she writes a dedication to Louisa. She describes Louisa as bold, cautious, and true, and my loving companion. I need argue no more after that, but I will. Finally, Flora died, as I mentioned, as this document shows in front of me, in 1923, and she was buried in Penn graveyard. Louisa lived 20 years more, and when she died, she was cremated and her ashes scattered on the South Downs. But it was her family arranged for this, so we guess it must be her wishes that a joint memorial in Penn Cemetery was placed for them both. And on that memorial is this wonderful, wonderful line in both their names: "We have been gloriously happy." So I have my own opinions, but I want to hear yours. What is it? Were they a loving lesbian couple? Were or not? Sue, have we got a poll that we can ask people?
We certainly have. Catherine, the audio was playing. I don't know if all our guests could hear it. Obviously you couldn't, but sorry, I was just trying to indicate that yes, it's all fine. You don't need to intervene, but you read it, so hopefully everybody actually got to hear the words, whether people could hear or not. Right, the polls. Yes, let's just see what you all think. So were they or weren't they? So it's a yes or no. Oh, right. Okay, I think it looks like everybody has voted there. So I'm going to stop and I'm going to share the results.
Oh, yes. Fantastic.
So I think after everything that you just said there, Catherine, I think I'd be inclined to say that they probably were a couple, even though we don't really have a very conclusive evidence, but a lot of that sounded very much like they were a couple rather than just friends, even very close and loving friends. Well, thank you very much indeed. That was a fantastic set of evidence from Daniel, and so what stories there. I'm particularly struck by the story about justification of people who are LGBTQ so early on, and that people were able to kind of see past all the bigotry and hatred. Some sad stories there, some funny stories there. The story of Anne Lister, which is probably very well known. If you haven't read her diaries, do. And Flora and Louisa being the daughter of Elizabeth Garrett Anderson. So some extraordinary people from history there, and some amazing stories. Right, so I'm just going to ask if anybody's got any questions. Thank you very much. We've got a brilliant night comment from one of our guests there. Thank you there for that. So Anne is saying, I don't think it really matters. What matters is that they loved each other and that they were gloriously happy. Absolutely right. Anybody got any questions that they would like to ask us about what we've been talking about? We can't claim, I think, to be experts in LGBTQ history in any shape or form, but if there's anything more you would like to ask us about plans or about some of the things that we've talked about. Okay, so we've got a question there, somebody asking, will we do something for Pride 2021? Really good question. Certainly Daniel and I have been talking about what we might do. As you may all, I'm sure all know, there's a bit of confusion about when museums are allowed to open, but just let me clarify, museums are not allowed to open before the 17th of May. So we hope that after that date that we will be allowed to do so. Obviously, it all depends on how everything is going. So at the moment, we have not particularly planned any large events, or indeed any events, but we would like to do something to mark Pride. And some of my poll questions in a minute will ask you about that. In fact, it might be perhaps a good idea to run into the polls now. And let's just see Well, let's see where we are. Right, so I've got some questions I'm going to ask you now, and then we'll come back to the pride question. So first of all, it really helps us to know how you heard about tonight, because that helps us to get our marketing right in the future. So we've asked you, where did you hear about it? Now, I quite appreciate there might be an answer that is not there. So if it isn't there, could you please post it in the Q&A if there is not an option that you want to tell us about. But do vote now. I'm just giving people time to do that. I can see the polls moving up and down whilst people think about what they're going to say. It is a multiple choice question, so you're not being asked to say one thing or the other. It could have been 2 or 3 different things that you saw it from. I think everybody's stopped voting. It's a bit difficult to tell sometimes. Right, okay, let's see what you've all said. There we go. So, there you go. Thank you very much, Buckinghamshire Council. It looks like you've brought quite a few people in tonight, so that's absolutely brilliant. Little bit of the kind of social media and WhatsApp and friends, so that's really helpful. Thank you very much. Right, let's go to another question. Right, so this is now about what you think about tonight. How has it gone? What did you like? What were the bits that were sort of really important to you? So was it the stories? Was it the archives? Was it about the story about the amazing doctors? We haven't got to the census questions yet, but so that's a bit difficult for you to vote on those, but we'll have Ross in a minute. Okay, I think most people have voted. So your archives stories have been really popular, and that's absolutely fantastic. We do thank you for bringing those along and letting people experience the sort of national picture really of what was going on. So fantastic. Okay, we'll go to our next one, which is the question that's just been asked. So 2 things really. So if we did future events, particularly at the moment I'm thinking online, to our questioner, so we've got some ideas. So one of the things that we thought was we might have people from the community talking about their own individual stories rather than me talking about objects and stories from our collections. So is that something you would be interested in? And then secondly, we thought a bit like the One Show. Do you remember when they did the Strictly Come Dancing routine? They taught everybody a move or 2 every night, and then they put together some footage of it at the end of the week. Well, what about something like that? Would you be interested in a sort of online drag makeup and dance routine that you get to join in at the end? So let's see. So this is what people are saying. So the LGBTQ speakers, so that might be something that we do as part of maybe a suite of events for Pride. It will really depend on how things go as to whether we can do on-site events or not, but we're certainly very keen not to lose the momentum of the last few years when we have been able to do Pride events. There's a sort of smattering of people interested in the drag makeup and dance, less so. So let me show you what that looks like now. So so we could certainly put on something with LGBTQ local speakers. We've already thought about how we might do that, and maybe a few people might be interested in the online drag results. So the answer is yes, we would very much like to do something for Pride, indeed. So just before we carry on with any questions, we're delighted to be joined by Ross Tackley. So from the Office of National Statistics, Ross Tackley is the Census Engagement Manager for Buckinghamshire. And as a Bucks resident, he is very excited to be delivering the once in 10 years census this year, and very pleased about the 3 new questions which he's come on just to talk about, because they're in regards to gender.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Ross, welcome.
Thank you very much. So this year, for 2001, we have got 3 new questions going into our census. We're also doing a digital first census, so we're encouraging as many people as possible to complete the census online, although paper copies are still available for anybody that would like one. The first new question is around veterans and asking if you've served in the armed forces, but the two new questions I really want to talk about are around sexual orientation and gender identification. So questions 25 and 26 now will be on those. It's the first time as a country, as a nation, we've asked those questions. So it's really progressive, particularly in a sort of 2021 landscape. It's just showing how far we've come even from the last census in 2011. So on the paper questionnaire, it'll be down here. These two questions, they are voluntary questions, so they join the question about religion. But I'd also like to just stress one thing as well, that because of the sensitivity around these questions for some people, particularly perhaps younger adults living at home still, they may not want to disclose that information on this household questionnaire, which may be filled in by a parent. So what we've done at the ONS is we've made it possible that anybody can request their own individual paper or online questionnaire. They'll then be able to fill in their answers as they wish, and then their individual questionnaire will override the answers that go on the household questionnaire, which is just fantastic. So we're really pleased about these new questions. We're celebrating them here in Bucks as well. So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to come along and just talk about them today. Census Day is the 21st of March. You should all start receiving your letters with the code in it next week. And this week you may have received a little postcard through your letterbox just telling you that it's coming. Thank you very much.
Well, that's great to hear that we have some kind of visibility within the census now. So that's great. And if anybody's got any questions that you want to ask about that, please do add them to the Q&A. And let's just see if we've got any other questions. So Alistair's got a question for the archive team. So he's saying about archives in general, if diaries are put into archives, how do we know they are fact? So for example, what would happen if someone from 2020's diaries were discovered? Would it be archived automatically? What makes a diary of value, or any item, to be accepted? Why would you basically accept something into the archives? I think that's saying.
Hey, that's Daniel, a really good question. What is fact? So I suppose thinking back to original primary sources, it's opinion. So what we're getting is the opinions of the thoughts of someone at the time. So I'm really interested in the French Revolution, for example. So a diary at the time could different perspectives on the same event. So the execution of the king, you might have a diary from someone who was a Republican who said, yes, this is great, this is brilliant. And you could have a diary from a monarchist who was saying this is a terrible tragedy. So primary sources and archives, they are really giving us a snapshot of what the individual who created them thinks, rather than being a fact. That's why they're historically important, particularly as we've seen today in some of the examples. They can really challenge widely held orthodox views. In terms of what, for Buckinghamshire Archives, what diaries, for example, we would take, all archives would have a collection policy. So if the diary came in, is it predominantly about Buckinghamshire or created about a Buckinghamshire person? And if it is, then we would preserve it for historical purposes. But of course, diaries can, I think, I haven't seen the question, but you mentioned sort of 20th century diaries. So there may well be, if a diary came in, there may well be legal reasons why it couldn't be made available initially, maybe data protection. If I was writing a diary, I could, write really sensitive things about other living individuals, which would mean that it might be kept on restricted access for 100 years and then be open for future historians to use. Don't know whether that answers the question, do you think?
Yeah, I think that certainly gives a very good overview of why you would accept them, why they're valuable, what is the value to them. Yep. We've got a question for Ross about the census. So one of our audience is asking, how are you spreading the word about the new census questions, in particular for young adults and the override option? Obviously, one of the answers to that question is coming on this webinar, but what else are you doing, Ross?
So we're doing a lot locally in Bucks. We're doing a lot of celebrating around the question in terms of social media and working with lots of different organisations to promote all three new questions. But nationally at the census, we are doing lots with the LGBTQ plus communities. There's lots going out in a lot of the magazines. Gay Times, for example, are doing a feature on it. We're also working with a lot of influencers on social media, so sort of Instagram influencers as well. They're going to run some material on that as well. And there's lots more going on in terms of the national campaign. There's a whole section in the national campaign dedicated to the LGBTQ plus community. So very, very lucky because there's only a few sort of separate campaigns running like that. So yeah, there's lots more to come for that. It'll all start sort of ramping up next week when we go into March.
Good, and thank you. And one more question from Mark saying, will indicating your gender or sexual orientation on the census make a difference in Bucks?
Oh, good question. Yes, because what we want to know at the ONS, we want to know how many sort of gay, lesbian people we have currently living and where they're living, so that we can continue to provide support for them as well, that may be in place. So in Bucks, that's something that's never been counted before. It's something we're not aware of. So it's going to be a really good insight and a good sort of starting point moving forward. The one thing that I found sort of lately is that there's there aren't that many organisations in Bucks, if you like, for the LGBTQ community, and that perhaps will be reflected after the census in terms of starting up new organisations and that kind of thing. So let's hope that in the next census, when that comes around, again, the landscape will have changed and these sort of talks will be much more frequent as well.
Thank you. That's great. We've got a few comments that people thanking. Alistair says thank you very much, and he hadn't thought about the sort of value of the evidence in the way that Daniel's just described. So he says thank you for that. And we've got perhaps one more question, and then I think we should bring the evening to a close just with one of the lovely quotes I'm going to quote from the Q&A that have been put in. But Beth asks, is there an open-minded view in the wider historic academic community over finding or interpreting LGBTQ histories? Don't know, Daniel, whether you'd like to take that one.
I think it's difficult to give a sort of comprehensive answer to that. I think there's a lot more awareness now and interest in LGBTQ history, and it's given. It's valued. I think that's an important word to use. It's valued far more now than it certainly has been in the past. And historians are increasingly willing to consider a person's sexuality. So in the past, the stories of the great and the good, the kings and the queens, and various figures in history, they might have been slightly two-dimensional. You might have known the dates they were born, or when they did a particular thing. But now I think people and historians are more interested in how in a person's sexuality and how that might have made them a rounder person, helped with their decision making and helped with their personality and their growth. So hopefully I'm answering the question, but I think that in terms of historians and LGBT history, LGBT research, in recent decades, it's really taken off, and I think it's far more valued, certainly than it has been previously.
Thank you, Daniel. That's a great answer there. We have a question from Aaron saying thank you very much for the talk this evening, asking about what you've been saying all evening, which is, how can I get involved, or how can we get involved in contributing to future collections and recording LGBTQ history? So I think, Erin, you've got my email address because I will have sent you the link in the first place. So if you want to just drop us an email saying I'd love to help you out, I'll redirect you to Daniel and colleagues. And if there are things that you can do to help the museum, we'd be absolutely delighted. So please do just drop us a line, and we would love you to get involved. One of the, we've had several other comments from people. I know one of the college contacts has said, actually, my students would love a drag tutorial. So there will be some people for whom, you know, that idea works really well, and there'll be some people who just, it's not their bag at all. But it's lovely to know that it would work for you. So we'll come back to you about that. Thank you. And I just want you to read to you as we end one of the comments in the Q&A from one of our guests. And she says, thank you. I'm still new to the LGBTQ community, so it's been lovely to connect with everybody tonight. Coming to both of the museum evenings has been an important part of my journey. So that's fantastic, and I hope that for everybody tonight, that we also have been an important part of your journey. And absolutely, it doesn't stop here. Do please keep an eye on both our websites, for the museum and for archives, and we will be doing something to celebrate Pride. It's just we're still really not quite sure what we're going to be allowed to do and what we're not going to be allowed to do, and it's been great to consult you about that this evening. So it only remains now for me to thank our two speakers, Daniel and Catherine, for some fantastic insights, which were clearly had hit the mark in terms of the audience tonight. It's exactly what they wanted to hear. And also to Ross for coming along. There's obviously a great deal of interest in what you had to say. So thank you for that, and thank you for promoting it. And for all of those of you who do watch or have watched It's Sin, I just have one thing to say to end the evening. La! Good night. Thank you very much, everybody. Good night.